In this video, we're going to do something a little bit different, and I want to borrow a concept from one medium and apply it to another. And we're going to talk about the establishing shot, which is a technique used in film that usually is the first shot of a movie or the first shot of a sequence that establishes the place and the mood that is being set. And so I want to talk about how this relates to photography, and hopefully this will bring up some awesome ideas and some inspiration from you guys. But first, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Storyblocks. Storyblocks is a massive online collection of B-roll, motion backgrounds, and even After Effects templates. So these are essentially blocks of assets that you can use to tell your story through video. Now, truth be known, most of the projects that I work on do not have massive Hollywood budgets. I don't have $3 million where somebody says, hey, go hire a helicopter and get this incredible skyline of New York City. I don't have that luxury. So for me, when I need a good establishing shot, or I need assets or motion typography or something to enhance my video, Storyblocks is where I go. Now, if you have ever used stock assets before, you know the drill. When you run into the wall with rights usage, you download the little low resolution copy and put it in your project, and it's all pixely and has a bad logo stamped on it. And what's cool is with Storyblocks, you don't have to worry about that stuff. It's kind of an all-you-can-eat thing, so just download the studio quality footage that you need. You can put it together to sell your story to a client. Everything is much better in the end. The other cool thing is Storyblocks is constantly updating their library with new stuff, so it never gets stale. So head over and check them out. I've got a link in the description below. I'll put it here as well. Check out Storyblocks, see if it's right for you. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to Storyblocks for sponsoring this episode of The Art of Photography. So let's talk about this idea of an establishing shot and how we can apply this to photography. And you may be thinking, Ted, this is a video technique. It doesn't apply to still images. And maybe you're right, but does it? And so first of all, let's talk about the difference, because there is a pretty stark difference between video work and still photography, in that a still photograph represents just a slice of time. It's just a still moment that we can experience in real time in a much different way. So that makes sense. We're observing this moment that's just a fraction of a second, but we can look at it, we can relook at it, we can study it, and so it's much different. The biggest difference between that and doing film work is in film you have the element of time, and you as a director or a creator can control all of that. You control the order of the elements that your audience sees. You control the pacing of that, and that either can make sense or it can disorient, but you can use either one of those to your advantage. So let's begin by talking about what is an establishing shot. So in filmmaking, an establishing shot is typically the first shot of the film, or at least the first shot of a scene. And what it does is it provides context. It sets up what the viewer is about to see. So for instance, I'll give you some really famous examples. Probably the best known of all time is the opening to the original Star Wars movie. We have a scene that is set in space. It's a planet that's clearly not Earth, so we know we're probably in another galaxy. And then we start to be introduced to the sense of scale with two fighting spacecraft. It is a very powerful shot, and it establishes what is to come in the film. I think another great example of this is a Western film called The Searchers. This was a great John Wayne film. It opens up with a really interesting vantage point of a woman opening up a door basically into Monument Valley, and we get a sense that this is a Western. It is beautifully shot. It's from a different angle, and so I think it's a really interesting establishing shot, but I think this is another one of the great ones. Another particularly famous one, and it's one of my favorite films ever, is the opening to Apocalypse Now. This is a movie that is pretty deep. It is set in Vietnam, and it deals with war, and so this opening shot is of a series of trees that catch fire because of the napalm attack that's going on. So each one of these shots is successful in that it establishes the place and the location for the story that's about to unfold. But I think there's a second piece of criteria that you need to consider for an establishing shot to be successful, and that is to set a mood. It's to get you into the story that you're about to see. One thing that's really cool is when this is successful, it's done non-verbally. It's done with visuals. So you see where we're starting to go into the photography world with this. Nothing is said, but something is set up in each one of these examples that sets that tone. So for instance, in the Star Wars example, I think it's the juxtaposition in size, the scale relationships between the two fighting ships. It's pretty obvious that the little ship has ticked off the larger ship, and a battle is ensuing, and something is about to unfold. And of course, we go on to see that a rebellion is happening against an empire that is awfully evil. And so in the second example, I think it's interesting because not only do we have basically that we're set in the desert, but we also have this sense of wonder and the sense of excitement that accompanies the classic Western film. And in the third example, obviously Vietnam is not a fun subject. It's very dark. It's very violent. And I think we see that set up. Nobody that actually gets killed in this shot that we can see, but it's pretty obvious that this jungle is burning and there are probably people inside. And then beyond that, we start to hear with the music, the Doors song in the end that comes on, and it sets a particularly interesting tone for a very serious film. Okay, so we understand what an establishing shot is. How does this relate to photography? I got somebody I want you to meet. So this is W Eugene Smith. W Eugene Smith is one of my favorite photographers of all time. He was one of the great photojournalists back in the days where Life magazine was one of the most popular places where people would get news stories. You have to remember that during this time, television and film were not where they are today, particularly television in terms of keeping up with a news cycle. Film was very expensive to produce. It was just a different time, and a lot of people looked to the pages of Life magazine to get their information. Eugene Smith was kind of the pioneer of this whole idea of the photo essay. And you can kind of see where I'm starting to go with this with an establishing shot. The photo essay, Eugene Smith would go out and he would cover a story, and then he would tell that in pictures. It was set by text that was written by somebody else. But what's interesting is looking back how strong these are, and this book is fabulous. I've done a whole video on W. Eugene Smith. I'll link it up here. I highly recommend you go check it out. But let's look at what he was doing with the photo essay. So one of the great examples is from 1948, and this was a story that Life ran on a country doctor who lived outside of Denver in Colorado. And this was a much different time, and I think this even still is relevant now when we look back and see what life was like in that era. And you see images in here of the doctor as he's administering to children and families. But what turns this from just being a report into something that's more cinematic in scope, into something that actually tells a story, is the way that Gene Smith used establishing shots. And I know that he fought a lot with the editors of Life magazine. He was very conscious of how that story should be told, the order things would come in, the page layout, the spread, so on and so forth. But this opening shot of the country doctor sets the tone, it sets the mood. It works just like the movie examples that I showed you before. One, we have a place, we can see we're in the country. Two, we set a mood because first of all, the doctor does not look like he's having a good time. It's a great day and he's off to go get his work done. He has a look of concern on his face. It's very dramatic. Also, we see this big storm brewing behind him. And so I think that this starts to tell a real story. And we see this repeated throughout the article. And I think that without these establishing shots, it's not as strong. It doesn't tell the same story. So this whole idea of the establishing shot in a photo essay is extremely important. And there are others as well. A Nurse Midwife from 1951 centers around Maud Callan, who is a state-certified nurse who is part of a state-run program where they're trying to tackle the problem of death during childbirth in South Carolina. And this is a really interesting story too. Of course, times have changed since the mid-century, but I think these live on as chronicling a document of what life was like in the rural South during that time, which is interesting because I think the photo essay, unlike just having photos of things, they tell a different story and they put context around things. And again, this whole idea of the establishing shot and showing how remote people are in terms of medical attention. This is a really powerful story. There's another one of Albert Schweitzer that was a little bit later, and this was the last project he did for Life. And this was pretty controversial because he felt like there was some photo editing that got in the way of the photojournalistic integrity. Mercy of Men from 1954. But again, the mood that he sets up with the establishing shot that begins this and as it carries through is pretty moving and it's pretty amazing. And it gives you not only a sense of place, but it sets up the story that's being told. And those are the two criteria that I keep hammering home here. So look in the show description. I will link up to my W. Eugene Smith video. I think another fascination that I have with Smith is that he was indeed a photographer, obviously, but I really feel like he was a frustrated artist in the sense that there was no medium at the time, and I think you could argue today there's still no medium that allows the type of artistic expression that he was trying to put out through photography. And let me clarify what that means. So one of his early projects was this project on Pittsburgh. He was supposed to go there for a couple weeks, chronicle the city. I saw a documentary the other day and they said, well, you could have sent Gene Smith anywhere, he would have over-chronicled it, and he sure did. He came back with literally tens of thousands of images. Editors have tried to put these in a book format. It's just too massive of a project. And the other one I think was interesting was when he moved into the Jazz Loft in New York City shortly thereafter, and he lived there for over 10 years. years. This was part of the loft jazz scene in New York at the time, and people like Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis and Salvador Dali and all these luminaries would come hang out in this loft that played music 24/7, it seemed. And so Gene Smith moved into this place, and not only did he take photos of the flower district outside his window, he had microphones and wired the entire place for sound. So we literally have tens of thousands of images that exist of the Jazz Loft in its heyday, and we have literally thousands of hours of recordings that were made, from everything between the jam sessions to phone calls that were made to conversations on the street to deliveries, everything. And what he was doing was he was chronicling this en masse through audio, but also through photography. And you look at what might be similar to something like this. Well, it's a place and time. By the time Gene Smith left the Jazz Loft, the scene had kind of dried up. A lot of the musicians had moved out. Unfortunately, drugs were a problem with that too. And so it was a very different place and time than when he originally got there, and his intent was to chronicle this. No one has ever been really able to put all that together into a cohesive project. There are documentaries on the Jazz Loft. There's a really good one that you can find on iTunes. I'll link that up in the description as well. Highly recommended. But that is one of the problems and one of the tragedies with W Eugene Smith, is that he is essentially capturing everything around a time and a place, and there's no way to display that. So we're out of the realm of the establishing shot, but I'm talking about the mass, and I'm talking about the drive that he had as an artist, because I think those are both really important. So you may say, Ted, how does this apply to photography today? We are not in the world of the photo essay anymore. Photography is not film. What I'm trying to get you to look at here is to be able to draw inspiration from another medium, so in this case film, and a technique that's involved in that medium, the establishing shot, and think just for a minute how photography has changed today, because I think this is one of those situations where we're all so close to the forest that we don't see the trees. I read comments in the videos, and whenever I talk about Instagram, I have a lot of people who complain about Instagram, and the follow for follow, or maybe it's a situation where, well, the people who are famous on Instagram do selfies, and it's this whole self-absorbed culture of somebody who wants to be a celebrity. Those things may be true, but when you look at Instagram as a medium, those things are successful because they're telling a story of somebody's life. If you look at what Casey Neistat did on YouTube when he was doing his vlog full-time, he was chronicling his everyday. And I think that there's something amazing about that, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I don't even think we've cracked the surface of what we can do with the mediums that we have now. We're not in an age where we have galleries, and museums are really not successful for people who are still alive for the most part. And so what are our outlets as photographers? Well, there is commercial work, but that has changed over the years too. But now we have social media, and love it or hate it, it is an opportunity there in front of us right now to be able to tell a story. What would W Eugene Smith do if he lived today? Well, he was a curmudgeon, so he'd probably complain about it, but who knows, maybe not. Maybe he would have totally embraced it, totally saw it as an avenue of expression and as a medium unto itself that he could use to tell some kind of story. And I think that's the hump that we can't get over for whatever reason. So I would love to hear what you guys think on this. Like, think in terms of, like, when somebody visits your Instagram profile, what's the first thing they see when they go to your grid there? Like, how does that lay out? How does it relate? Does it tell a story? I could tell you right now, mine has problems and it doesn't. Well, that seems like a perfect opportunity to be able to put something sequential that does give somebody a bigger picture into what's happening. So again, this idea of the establishing shot, how does that relate? How does it tell a story? How do these photographs all work together? These are the things that are really important that I want us all to think about. And I think this is a discussion that we can come back to from time to time. And it may be interesting to look at other cinematic types of influences that we can find as well. Anyway, drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. I'm getting long-winded. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.